My name is Evelyn Harper, and I'm 65. I never imagined that at this age, walking into my daughter's family Christmas party would feel like stepping onto a battlefield. Yet here I was, bundled into my long wool coat, the winter wind biting through the streets of suburban Madison as I approached the familiar red brick house that had once felt like home. Now every snow-dusted walkway and carefully trimmed shrub carried the weight of unspoken judgment. I took a deep breath and adjusted the scarf around my neck, trying to steady the nervous flutter in my chest. It wasn't just the cold. It was the anticipation of their eyes, the weight of their opinions pressing down on me, like a hand on my shoulder I could never shake. My daughter Marissa had called a small family gathering, but I knew better. Even a casual dinner with my in-laws had the potential to feel like a courtroom. I parked at the end of the driveway and stepped out my boots, crunching in the thin layer of frost. The house looked normal, lights twinkling on the porch, the scent of pine drifting through the air, but inside, I knew the atmosphere would be anything but calm. My heart beat faster with each step toward the door. Every year, I'd tried to navigate their expectations, careful not to stumble, careful not to give them a reason to question me. Yet this year, I couldn't hide the truth I carried in my heart. As I rang the doorbell, I forced my shoulders to stay straight. The door swung open, and Marissa greeted me with a polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Mom, come on in," she said. Her voice was soft, but the tension behind it was palpable. I stepped inside and was immediately greeted by the hum of holiday chatter, the clinking of dishes, and the subtle undertone of scrutiny that had always been there, threading through every conversation. I set my coat down, smoothing it over the back of a chair, and allowed myself a small, private inhale. This was it. Another Christmas. Another dance with their expectations. I glanced around the room, noting the familiar faces of relatives who had perfected the art of polite disapproval. My daughter's smile was tight. My son-in-law's nod polite but distant, and the corners of the room seemed to close in on me. I lifted my chin and moved toward the living room, each step deliberate. Tonight, I couldn't remain invisible, not when the truth I carried demanded to be acknowledged. I just had to figure out the right moment to reveal it, to let them see who I was now, rather than the version they wanted me to be. The house smelled faintly of pine and baking spices, a comforting reminder of holidays past. Yet tonight, the familiarity did nothing to calm the knot of anticipation in my chest. I smoothed my skirt and tugged at the scarf around my neck, though it offered no protection against the anxiety I carried. My hands closed around the small envelope tucked inside my coat pocket, the weight of it grounding me even as my pulse quickened. I had rehearsed this moment endlessly. Every step, every word, every possible reaction had been played through in my mind, a private performance for an audience that had no idea what was coming. Caleb, patient and calm as ever, stood beside me, his hand brushing against mine in quiet reassurance. He knew the story I carried, the choice we had made together, and he had trusted me to reveal it in my own way, in my own time. Marissa flitted through the kitchen, arranging plates and glasses, her movements precise, almost rehearsed. I caught her glance briefly. Her eyes held a polite expectation, as though she could sense I carried news that might unsettle the evening's carefully curated calm. I offered a small smile, letting my own steadiness radiate outward, hoping it would temper her suspicion without revealing the true depth of my resolve. I walked toward the living room, feeling the weight of every familiar gaze, cousins, aunts, uncles, each of them poised to measure, judge, and compare. I knew some would barely notice, distracted by small talk and wine, while others would scrutinize every gesture, waiting for the slightest sign of hesitation. That scrutiny, that constant evaluation had followed me for decades, shaping my reactions, my choices, and my sense of self. Tonight, however, the narrative belonged entirely to me. I paused near the sofa, brushing imaginary dust from my hands, and allowed a deep breath to center me. This was more than an announcement. It was a declaration of autonomy, a statement that the life I had chosen with Caleb was not up for negotiation or critique. The envelope felt heavier now, not with paper, but with the weight of truth. As the first course was set, and chatter hummed lightly through the room, I felt the familiar old impulse to shrink, to soften, to make myself smaller, so as not to disturb the equilibrium. But I pushed it aside. I had learned the value of measured calm, the quiet authority of owning your choices without seeking permission or validation. This moment demanded it more than any other. Caleb leaned closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're ready," he said. I nodded, squeezing his hand briefly, drawing strength from the simple connection. Together we represented a life built on mutual respect and shared decisions, a life I had fought to protect from the judgmental eyes that now filled the room. I straightened, lifted my chin, and waited for the right moment. Every smile, every gesture, every sip of wine around the table sharpened the contrast between expectation and reality. And then I would speak, revealing not only our commitment, but the truth that had been mine to claim all along. The room would listen, whether they understood or not, and I would stand firm, unshakable in the choices that had brought me here. Tonight, I thought I would finally take my life back in my own hands. The anticipation surged through me, but it was no longer fear. It was the quiet, exhilarating weight of truth, waiting to be unveiled. The moment had been building for weeks, a quiet tension that settled over me as soon as I stepped into Marissa's living room. I had come prepared to reveal the choice that Caleb and I had made, knowing that it would challenge the carefully constructed expectations of my family. But nothing could have prepared me for the force of words that would hit me first. Marissa stepped forward, her posture perfect. Her expression carefully measured every line of her body, suggesting control and authority. She was 15 years younger than I had been when I first learned what it meant to endure judgment, but in that moment, she commanded the room with the same intensity that had defined her childhood. Her gaze found mine and held it unflinching, as though she were about to strip away everything I had built inside myself. "Mom," she said, her voice tight and deliberate, "we need to be honest about one thing." The air seemed to still the hum of conversation from other relatives fading to a tense silence. I held my breath waiting, but my mind remained sharp, prepared to meet whatever came with the steadiness I had cultivated over decades. Her eyes narrowed ever so slightly. "In our eyes, you're already dead." The words struck with a precision that cut through the years of effort, of careful navigation, of seeking approval that had never truly come. The room seemed to freeze around me. I could hear the soft gasp of a cousin, the faint shuffle of a chair from an aunt, and even the quiet click of a fork dropped in hesitation. Yet I did not flinch. I did not retreat. I studied her face carefully, every expression, every twitch of a muscle, the subtle curl of her lips that betrayed satisfaction in delivering the blow. I saw in her eyes the echoes of judgment, the reflection of a standard I had been measured against all my life. And for a brief, shocking moment, I felt the familiar pull of old fear, the instinct to diminish, to shrink, to vanish under the weight of disapproval. Then I remembered the years, the decades, the countless moments when judgment had been wielded as power. I remembered Caleb's calm steadiness, the life we had begun to build together, and the hard-won clarity that my worth was not defined by the opinions of others. My shoulders straightened, my chin lifted, and my breath came slow and deliberate. "Understood," I said simply, deliberately. The word hung in the air between us, heavier than any argument, more powerful than any plea or defense. It was not defiance, it was recognition of reality. Her words had been delivered sharp and unyielding, and my response was measured, unshakable. I allowed the silence to settle, letting the weight of decades of control and expectation crystallize into a single clear moment of autonomy. I placed my hands lightly on the back of a chair, feeling Caleb's presence beside me, his hand brushing mine in quiet solidarity. Every glance from Marissa, every flicker of surprise on her face, only reinforced the line I had drawn. I would not allow their judgment to dictate my life. Slowly, deliberately, I turned toward the door. Each step was steady, purposeful, a movement of ownership over my own choices. The cold December air outside was bracing as I stepped into it, but it felt like a release, a tangible affirmation of freedom. The door clicked softly behind me, and with it, I left behind years of expectation, comparison, and silent suffering. For the first time in decades, I walked away entirely on my own terms, carrying only the certainty that my life and my choices belonged solely to me. The door closed behind me with a soft click, leaving the warm glow of Marissa's living room behind. Outside, the December air was crisp, biting at my cheeks, and yet I felt a clarity I had never known in the middle of a confrontation. Marissa's words still echoed in my mind. "In our eyes, you're already dead." But I did not feel the old sting of panic or the need to defend myself. Instead, a quiet, steady calm settled over me. Caleb's hand brushed mine as he walked beside me down the snow-dusted sidewalk. His presence was a gentle anchor, reminding me that I was not alone in facing the judgments that had always haunted me. I drew in a slow breath, letting the cold air fill my lungs and clear the remnants of tension. Every step forward felt deliberate, a silent affirmation that I would not let their words define me. I thought of all the years I had spent trying to meet expectations, molding myself to fit standards that were never mine. Childhood dinners, family holidays, every polite criticism they had taught me. Resilience, yes, but also the importance of measured response. I had learned that true strength was not always in confrontation. Sometimes it lay in patient observation and the quiet decision to remain composed. The snow crunched beneath our boots as we continued down the street, and I felt the weight of decades lifting. I remembered the countless moments when I had flinched at judgment, when anger or frustration would bubble beneath the surface, and how often it had left me drained, powerless, and still under someone else's control. Now, for the first time, I recognized the power of holding my ground without lashing out. Caleb gave my hand a reassuring squeeze. "You're handling this perfectly," he said, his voice low and steady. I allowed a small smile to escape feeling the truth in his words. The calm I felt was not passive. It was deliberate, an assertion of autonomy, built on years of learning, of surviving, of understanding my own worth. We paused at a corner, looking out over the frozen river that wound through Madison. The city was quiet at this hour, the faint glow of streetlights reflecting off the ice, and I let the stillness seep into me. I realized that calmness was not surrender. It was power, a deliberate choice to meet confrontation without giving it the control it sought. I lifted my chin slightly, feeling the cold air on my face, and knew that this moment marked a turning point. I had chosen to meet cruelty with measured composure rather than reaction. The decision was mine, and it carried a weight far greater than any argument could ever achieve. For the first time in decades, I felt the quiet confidence of knowing that my life, my choices, and my responses were entirely my own. The judgment of others could no longer shake me, and in that stillness, I discovered a freedom I had never imagined possible. Even now, decades later, the memory of my childhood in Madison is sharp, etched with the precision of expectation and judgment. I was Evelyn Harper, then a girl with wide eyes and an eager heart, but every step I took was measured against rules I could not see and standards I could never reach. My mother Margaret ruled our house like a general overseeing a battlefield, her voice a constant presence dictating what was acceptable and what was not. My older sister Lydia was the golden standard. Every note she played on the piano, every essay she submitted, every award she won was celebrated with exuberant approval. Mother's gaze would follow her with a warmth I rarely felt directed at me. And there I was, trying to carve a place for myself in the narrow shadows that remained. I remember showing her a drawing I had labored over for weeks, only to hear, "Why can't you be more like Lydia?" The words were not a critique, but a verdict, a reminder that my best effort would never be enough. Even friendships were monitored. Margaret disapproved of children she considered distractions, and I quickly learned to hide those I cared about most. My best friend from 5th grade, who loved comic books and messy sketches, was deemed unsuitable. I sneaked calls, whispered plans, and met her in secret, navigating a world where even innocence had to be controlled. My father, David, observed quietly, nodding along with her decisions, rarely intervening. When I complained about missing a play date or a small opportunity to explore on my own, he would sigh and say, "Your mother knows best," and that settled every argument before it even began. Every meal at the family table was an exercise in restraint. Cousins, aunts, and uncles observed sometimes with subtle amusement, sometimes with genuine curiosity, but always with judgment, lurking beneath the surface. I would push my food around my plate, shrinking into the corner, while Lydia recounted her latest achievement. She would smile knowingly, tossing a remark like, "It's not that hard." Evelyn and my face would burn with frustration I dared not voice. I learned early that compliance, quiet endurance, and invisibility were safer than defiance. School was no refuge. Mother chose my classes, vetoed electives. She deemed frivolous art, drama, music unless it aligned with her vision, and demanded I join debate to build character. I hated it, the endless preparation, the anxiety of performing under critical eyes, the gnawing fear of embarrassment. Every stumble, every misstep was magnified, and her sharp voice would follow me home, a relentless echo. "You're embarrassing us." My friends weren't free either. Their lives were scrutinized for proximity to my shortcomings. The pattern extended to holidays and celebrations. Every performance, every recital, every award ceremony was staged, not for me, but as proof of family success. Lydia thrived under these conditions, absorbing praise and approval with ease. I learned to observe, to anticipate reactions, and to measure my own worth in secret. A small victory, like a writing contest or an art show, was quietly tucked away unacknowledged, leaving me to cherish it in private. Yet in the shadows of control and comparison, something quietly took root. I began to notice the power of patience, observation, and subtle defiance. I learned to assert myself in small ways, choosing a book to read when I was allowed, spending a few extra minutes drawing or quietly correcting an answer in class without seeking praise. These acts, though minor, were the foundation of a resilience that would carry me through a lifetime of expectation and judgment. Looking back, I understand now that childhood under scrutiny shapes more than skill or demeanor. It cultivates awareness, careful judgment, and the capacity for measured response. The quiet endurance I cultivated, the ability to observe without immediate reaction, and the deep understanding of my own worth were lessons learned in a house where approval was conditional and love was often measured by performance. Those early experiences forged the Evelyn who could walk into her daughter's living room decades later, face words meant to wound and respond, not with anger, but with calm, deliberate composure. Every boundary I would later set, every step I would take toward autonomy, was rooted in the lessons learned in those formative, controlled years. I had survived judgment, comparison, and quiet exclusion, and in doing so, had learned the power of resilience, patience. By the time I reached my teenage years, the lessons of my childhood had settled deep into my bones. I was Evelyn Harper, 16, and restless, craving the freedom my mother never seemed willing to grant. Each choice I wanted to make, whether joining the photography club, staying after school for theater, or even choosing my own friends, required negotiation, often ending with her disapproval or outright refusal. But I began to find small cracks where I could assert myself, testing boundaries, cautiously, savoring the taste of independence. I remember discovering the local library's photography workshop on a rainy afternoon, hiding the flyer in my backpack before my mother could see it. It was a quiet rebellion, almost invisible, yet it felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. The smell of developing chemicals, the click of the shutter, and the thrill of capturing something fleeting gave me a sense of ownership over my own experience that I had rarely known. For the first time, I was creating without anyone watching, without judgment waiting at the next corner. High school brought its own set of challenges. I enrolled in courses that interested me, literature, history, and eventually marketing, though I dared not mention the last one to my parents. My mother monitored every grade, every extracurricular activity, and I learned to navigate her scrutiny with a careful blend of honesty and omission. Yet even under her watchful eye, I began to trust myself making small decisions that reflected my priorities rather than hers. College was liberation. The University of Wisconsin campus pulsed with life, a chaotic contrast to the rigid structure I had known at home. I joined clubs, led projects, and spent late nights sketching campaigns for the Student Advertising Society. For the first time, my efforts were judged on their merit, not as an extension of my family's reputation. Professors and peers recognized my abilities, calling me capable, creative, and reliable. Their praise didn't come with strings attached. It was authentic, and it taught me that my value wasn't dependent on anyone else's approval. I also met people who mirrored the curiosity and independence I had long suppressed. Friends who challenged me, encouraged me, and treated my opinions with respect. Their presence reminded me that connection could exist without control or judgment, and that I was capable of building relationships on my own terms. It wasn't always easy. Even as a young adult, phone calls from my mother demanding explanations about my schedule, my grades, and even the friends I spent time with tugged at the freedom I was carving for myself. But I learned to respond with calm determination, to hold my ground politely yet firmly. Every moment of resistance, every small victory shaped the woman I was becoming, the Evelyn who would eventually face her daughter's harsh words without fear. In those years, I discovered something essential. Finding your own voice isn't a single moment of rebellion. It's 1,000 careful decisions, each one reinforcing the sense that your life belongs to you alone. It was one of those bitterly cold early spring afternoons in Madison, the kind where the wind cuts straight through your coat and leaves your cheeks tingling long after you come indoors. My old sedan had sputtered to a halt on a quiet side street, a flat tire leaving me stranded and frantic. I stepped out, shivering, fumbling with the spare in the trunk, cursing myself for never learning basic car maintenance. I didn't notice him at first until I heard the steady clink of metal and the faint hum of concentration. He was crouched over an engine, sleeves rolled up, hands coated in grease, completely absorbed in his work. There was a calmness about him, a focus so precise it made the world around him fade to gray. I hesitated, unsure if I should interrupt, unsure if someone so absorbed would even notice me. "Need some help?" he asked without looking up. His voice was calm even, and carried none of the judgment I had grown accustomed to over the decades. In that instant, I felt my chest tighten, the mixture of fatigue and defensiveness I always carried whenever someone appeared to judge me dissipating slightly. I think my timing belt snapped. I admitted, my hands nervously clutching my purse. I hated the way I sounded, flustered and exposed. Most people would have dismissed me, assumed incompetence, or offered a condescending pat on the shoulder. But he didn't flinch. He nodded, methodical and deliberate. "Let's take a look," he said finally, meeting my gaze. His eyes were steady, not piercing or dismissive, but kind, honest, and completely present. I felt a rare moment of relief, a tiny flicker of trust I hadn't allowed myself in years. As he worked, he explained each step, walking me through the process without once making me feel inferior. I asked questions careful and cautious, and he answered each one with patience and clarity, never condescending, never rushing. I was struck by the stark contrast between him and every person I had ever known who measured worth by wealth, position, or appearances. Caleb, the name he finally offered, treated me as an equal in that small garage, not a problem to solve or a curiosity to humiliate. We talked while he worked. He spoke of his trade, the pride he took in solving complex problems, the satisfaction in a task completed with skill and care. I found myself laughing freely at his anecdotes, something I rarely allowed myself to do around family or colleagues who were quick to critique. There was no pretense, no expectation of approval. In his presence, I could breathe. Time passed in a strange, suspended way. I realized I had been holding my breath without noticing it, waiting for judgment or mockery, but it never came. He listened, really listened, when I spoke about my own frustrations, my own dreams, and my fear of being invisible in a world obsessed with perfection. Every word I spoke was met with understanding, not dismissal. By the time he finished, my car was running perfectly. He handed me a slip of paper with his number. "Call if you need anything." He said, his expression calm but open. There was no expectation, no pressure, just an offer of connection. I tucked the paper into my purse, feeling something stir inside me. A spark of possibility. Something I had not dared to hope for in years. As I drove away, I couldn't stop thinking about the ease, the honesty, and the quiet strength he had shown. In Caleb, I recognized something rare, respect untainted by social expectation, kindness unburdened by judgment, and a steadiness that made the chaos of my past feel distant. For the first time in a long time, I felt seen, not for how well I performed, not for the appearance of my life, but for simply who I was. That evening, back in my small apartment, I stared at the number in my purse and smiled. It was more than just a man I had met. It was the possibility of a life built on trust, mutual respect, and honesty. A life that I could finally envision as entirely my own. Caleb had entered it quietly, carefully, but he had changed the course of everything. The days leading up to the family dinner felt like walking a tightrope. I spent hours pacing my apartment in Madison, rehearsing what I might say, how I might present Caleb, and bracing myself for the inevitable scrutiny. At 65, I had learned that preparation was as much about mental fortitude as it was about logistics. My hands often curled around a cup of tea, warm and grounding, while my mind traced every possible reaction my family might have, every glance, every whispered comment, every judgment lurking behind polite smiles. Caleb moved quietly around the apartment, packing his tools and personal items for the evening. He didn't press me for details, didn't offer unsolicited advice, but every once in a while, he would reach over to squeeze my hand, grounding me. His calm steadied me in ways that I hadn't realized I needed. With him, there was no need to perform. My worth was accepted without condition, without comparison. I thought about my daughter Marissa, and her unwavering scrutiny, the unspoken rules that governed every interaction. I thought about the subtle judgments my siblings, aunts, and uncles had perfected over decades, and the careful calculations I had learned to make to survive their gatherings. Tonight would be different. I wasn't stepping in just as Evelyn Harper, the cautious daughter who measured every word. I would step in as Evelyn Harper, fully myself, with Caleb by my side. We went over the small details together, how to greet everyone, the timing of our entrance, even the conversation starters. Caleb asked about nothing more than the facts, names, relationships, a brief overview of the family dynamic. He didn't try to mold the evening into something artificial. He simply wanted me to feel safe, confident, and steady. I ran my fingers over the small envelope tucked into my coat pocket, the one containing the final proof of our commitment. Our decision to marry had been quiet, intentional, and entirely ours. No one else had had the right to shape that choice, and tonight it would finally be revealed not as a plea for approval, but as a statement of truth. I looked at myself in the mirror, noticing the faint lines around my eyes, the silver streaks in my hair, and the firmness of my jaw. Age had given me clarity and resilience. I was not the timid girl who had shrunk under my mother's gaze, nor the cautious woman who had spent decades seeking approval from her family. I was my own authority now, and that authority would extend to the room I was about to enter. Caleb adjusted his jacket and gave me a small, reassuring smile. "We'll handle it together," he said quietly. And I nodded, feeling a steadiness settle in my chest. Whatever judgments awaited us tonight, whatever whispers or rolling eyes, we would face them side by side. The preparation, the planning, the careful mental rehearsal, all of it coalesced into a single truth. We were ready. As we stepped out into the crisp evening air, the lights of Madison glowing softly along the streets, I felt a mixture of apprehension and anticipation. Tonight, everything would change, and I would finally introduce Caleb to my family on my own terms. We arrived at my daughter Marissa's house just as the last hints of daylight were fading over Madison. The porch lights glowed softly, wreaths swaying in the winter breeze. But the warmth outside belied the tension I already felt creeping in as we stepped across the threshold. Caleb offered a quiet squeeze of my hand, and I returned it, feeling a tether to steadiness, as we were immediately greeted by polite smiles that didn't quite reach the eyes of our hosts. Marissa moved quickly to usher us into the dining room. "Mom, Caleb, welcome," she said. Her tone measured, almost rehearsed the slightest edge of tension threading through her words. "Daniel." Her husband gave a brief nod, but his eyes were elsewhere, scanning the room as though evaluating our presence as a potential disruption. The table was set beautifully, every plate, glass, and silverware aligned perfectly, a display of precision that seemed to underscore the control Marissa and her husband exerted over every detail of their home. Aunt Helen and Uncle Marcus sat at the far end, their polite smiles directed at us, but the subtle lifting of eyebrows and quick glances exchanged between them spoke volumes. They were the silent jury weighing our worth before we had even taken a bite. I took my seat carefully, letting Caleb slide in beside me. I noticed Lydia, my younger sister across the table, perched with the easy confidence that had always defined her. Her gaze flicked to Caleb almost immediately, and I could see the calculation behind her smile. She whispered something to Marissa, and I caught the faint, unmistakable curl of scorn in her expression. "Caleb, what exactly do you do again?" Marissa asked, her voice polite, but pointed, an almost imperceptible challenge lingering in the air. I felt Caleb straighten his hand, tightening around mine under the table. "I run a small automotive repair shop," he replied calmly. "I love working with my hands, solving problems." A ripple of barely suppressed laughter came from Lydia. "That's interesting," she said, tilting her head as though appraising a peculiar specimen. The subtle judgment was clear. My mother would have been proud of this scrutiny in its own way had she been here, but I let it pass, feeling the familiar old stirrings of discomfort. Only this time I didn't shrink. Dinner proceeded slowly, every sentence layered with subtext. Marissa commented on Caleb's lack of formal education. Lydia compared him to her friend's fiancé, a young lawyer climbing the corporate ladder, and even Daniel seemed to weigh every word before speaking. But through it all, Caleb remained steady, answering questions with patience, never raising his voice, never letting the tension disturb his composure. I could feel the heat rising in my chest at the subtle digs, the comparisons that always seemed to measure people by wealth, prestige, or pedigree rather than heart or character. But instead of reacting, I leaned into the calm I had cultivated over a lifetime. Every glance, every whispered judgment, every polite question that carried a sting, none of it could touch me unless I allowed it. When Lydia leaned across and said, "I'm just surprised Mom didn't insist you meet someone with more ambition," I caught Caleb's hand under the table and gave it a gentle squeeze. He met my gaze with understanding, a silent reminder that our choices and our life together were our own. I nodded, taking a breath, and let my expression remain serene. By the time dessert arrived, the tension had not lifted, but neither had it broken me. I had survived every critique, every comparison, every shadow of judgment that had haunted me since childhood. Tonight was just the first test, and I knew deep in my bones that I was ready for the ones to come. I had sat through the first courses navigating the delicate balance of conversation and subtle judgment. When the final comment came, a thinly veiled jab aimed directly at Caleb. Lydia leaned forward, her voice just above polite. "Evelyn, you've really chosen someone unconventional, haven't you? I suppose it's good that he keeps busy with his little shop." The words were deliberate, meant to sting, and for a moment, I felt the familiar flicker of that old panic, the one that had haunted my childhood, the one that had driven me to shrink, to hide, to bend. But I inhaled deeply, letting the memory of years of restraint, of careful observation, settle into a steady calm. I was not that girl anymore. I would not shrink. I felt Caleb's hand brush mine under the table. His calm presence reminded me that our lives were ours to define. I could feel the tension radiating from the family, the weight of their expectations pressing down. Yet I remained centered. Every glance from Lydia, every faint smirk from Marissa, every subtle narrowing of an uncle's eyes was a test. And I had learned over a lifetime of such tests that silence carried more power than any impulsive argument. When Lydia's comment hung in the air, I let my eyes meet hers directly. Slowly, deliberately, I placed my fork down and said, "Caleb is honest, hardworking, and supports me in ways none of you have. That is enough." My voice was measured, firm and calm. The room fell silent, not the polite quiet of a normal family dinner, but the sharp, uncomfortable pause of people who had not anticipated being challenged. Marissa's lips parted slightly, but no words came. My mother, seated across from me, blinked, her hands momentarily still on her napkin. Even Uncle Marcus, usually unflappable, stiffened in his chair. The air felt heavier, charged with the quiet force of a boundary being drawn. I continued, letting the calmness deepen. I will not apologize for the people I love or the choices I make for myself. If anyone cannot respect that, I will step away. It was not a threat nor a plea, it was a declaration. I could feel the old panic rising faintly at the edges of my awareness, but I pushed it down. This was not anger, not rebellion for the sake of defiance. This was measured, deliberate, and rooted in decades of understanding my own worth. I had learned that the weight of judgment from others cannot diminish the value of a life chosen deliberately. Caleb gave my hand another reassuring squeeze, and I felt a grounding certainty I had never known in my family's presence before. The room shifted subtly. The older relatives exchanged glances, realizing that their familiar control had no purchase here. They had spent years shaping, directing, and critiquing, but tonight they saw clearly that their influence ended where my autonomy began. I leaned back slightly, still holding Caleb's hand, letting the quiet of our shared understanding fill the space. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. My calm, deliberate assertion had done what words alone often cannot. It had drawn a line in the sand. For the first time in decades, I felt the weight of my own authority, the clarity that comes from knowing who you are and what you will no longer tolerate. The night had shifted. The tension remained, but it was tempered now by the unmistakable fact that I had claimed my space and no one, no judgment, no comparison, no expectation could take it from me. The remainder of dinner passed with the uneasy quiet of unspoken acknowledgement. I sipped my wine, slowly feeling the warmth spread through me. Silence, measured and deliberate, had spoken louder than any argument ever could, and I knew it was only the beginning of the boundaries I would enforce and the freedom I would claim. The first morning in our new apartment felt like stepping into a life I had only glimpsed in daydreams. Caleb and I unpacked boxes, slowly, carefully arranging books, kitchenware, and personal mementos in a space that was entirely ours. The sunlight streamed through the large windows, dust motes dancing in the air like tiny sparks of promise. I paused for a moment, taking it all in. For the first time in decades, every choice here belonged to me. We had found a modest apartment in downtown Madison, a quiet street lined with old brick buildings, and the faint scent of coffee drifting from nearby cafes. The space was small, but warm, filled with potential, and every corner reflected the life we intended to build. Caleb moved between rooms, effortlessly placing tools and objects with a precision that reminded me of his work ethic and care. I watched him for a moment, a small smile tugging at my lips. Here was a man whose presence grounded me, whose support never carried the weight of judgment. Our routines developed naturally, almost imperceptibly. Mornings began with coffee brewed in our small kitchen, the sound of water dripping into the pot, a comforting constant. We'd read the paper together, talk quietly about plans for the day, or sit on the balcony watching the city awaken beneath us. Simple things, preparing meals, arranging flowers in a vase, folding laundry together, became little rituals, markers of a life shaped entirely by choice rather than expectation. I discovered a small joy in reclaiming autonomy over the smallest details. The way I hung the curtains, the colors I chose for the walls, even the music we played in the evenings. All of it was affirmation that I could finally make decisions without seeking approval or fearing criticism. For years, I had bent myself to meet others' expectations, and now, for the first time, I could shape my life to suit my own heart. Caleb's presence made the freedom tangible. He never imposed, never questioned the decisions I made, and his steady encouragement reminded me that our partnership was based on mutual respect. When he fixed a leaky faucet or rearranged a shelf, he included me in the process, listening to my opinions, valuing my input. It was a subtle but powerful contrast to the controlling dynamics I had known my entire life. Evenings were filled with laughter and quiet conversation. We discovered little corners of Madison together, a tiny bookstore tucked into a side street, a coffee shop with cracked tiles and strong espresso, a park where the light through the trees felt like a spotlight just for us. Every shared discovery reinforced the reality that our life was ours to create, unshaped by lingering judgment or comparison. There were moments when old fears surfaced, tiny pangs of guilt for leaving my daughter and family's expectations behind, but they were fleeting. Each morning, as I moved through our apartment, seeing Caleb beside me and the small markers of our shared life, the anxiety melted into a sense of grounded certainty. We were building a world where neither of us had to shrink, where laughter and work, love and independence existed side by side. By the end of the first week, I realized that this space, this life was no longer borrowed or temporary. It was ours, and the freedom it represented was unlike any I had known before. For the first time in decades, I felt a quiet, sustained joy. A joy rooted not in the approval of others, but in the certainty that we were living the life we had chosen together. The morning sunlight streamed through the windows of our downtown Madison apartment, glinting off the edges of my laptop as I sipped a strong cup of coffee. The agency where I had been consulting for the past year had asked me to lead a campaign for a major local nonprofit, and the magnitude of the opportunity made my chest tighten with a mix of nerves and excitement. For decades, I had been cautious, measured, hesitant to stake my claim in any arena where failure might bring judgment. Today, that caution transformed into focus. Caleb leaned against the counter, watching me with quiet pride. "You've got this," he said, his tone simple but grounding. There was no condescension, no pressure, just a steady belief in my ability to succeed. I smiled at him, the warmth of his support offsetting the lingering echo of family expectations I had carried for so long. At the office, the campaign was already buzzing with energy. Designers, copywriters, and strategists surrounded me, their chatter punctuated by the hum of printers and the soft click of keyboards. I felt a thrill of anticipation as I laid out the concept, highlighting the nonprofit's mission and the creative approach we would take. My colleagues listened attentively, nodding at key points, asking insightful questions, and offering constructive suggestions. There was no underlying judgment, no need to defend my ideas, only a collaborative focus on results. The first presentation to the client went better than I could have imagined. As I outlined the vision, detailing the strategy, budget, and creative direction, I felt the room lean in. Questions were thoughtful engagement, genuine, and by the end, the client was smiling, nodding with enthusiasm. "This is exactly what we hoped for," the director said, shaking my hand firmly. A flush of pride rose in me, the kind that comes not from comparison or expectation, but from the realization that my work, my choices, and my expertise had value in their own right. Back in the apartment that evening, Caleb poured 2 glasses of wine, and we toasted quietly, letting the accomplishment settle between us. "You were unstoppable today," he said, his eyes reflecting sincerity rather than judgment. I felt a warmth spread through me, a reassurance that validation could exist beyond family approval. Over the following weeks, the campaign progressed, gaining attention across Madison. Billboards went up, social media ads launched, and the community responded enthusiastically. I received calls and emails praising my leadership, my creative vision, and the effectiveness of the campaign. Each acknowledgement, each note of appreciation, chipped away at the invisible chains of self-doubt I had carried for decades. I reflected on how different this felt from the constant scrutiny of family gatherings, the subtle comparisons, the quiet disapproval that had marked so many of my formative years. Here, people evaluated me based on my competence, creativity, and dedication. My worth was tangible, measurable by results, and recognized without reservation. Sitting on the balcony one evening, overlooking the lights of Madison, reflecting in the river, I realized something profound. Success, achieved on my own terms, carried a validation that no family judgment could erase. It was not about proving anything to anyone else anymore. It was about acknowledging finally that I was capable, deserving, and complete in my own right. And as Caleb wrapped an arm around my shoulders, leaning close to share the quiet joy of the evening, I knew that this life, my work, our partnership, our choices, was mine entirely. The freedom to succeed, to thrive, and to be recognized for myself was the gift I had long been denied. It was mid-March when the first news reached me, delivered casually over the phone by Margaret Evans, an old friend of the family, who somehow remained neutral amidst the undercurrents of judgment and comparison. I could hear the tension in her voice, the subtle hesitation, as she chose each word carefully. "Evelyn, it's about Marissa," she began, and I braced myself, expecting the usual drama of family squabbles. Instead, what followed was a cascade of misfortune that unfolded with a clarity I could not ignore. Marissa had invested a significant portion of her savings, more than $60,000, into what she had been told was a promising startup opportunity, an exclusive investment recommended by a man she trusted. The venture was a scam. The project never existed, and every dollar vanished. I listened quietly, letting Margaret's words wash over me. I felt no need to react, no impulse to interject, no sense of satisfaction. Beyond the recognition of the inevitable consequences of choices made without caution or reflection. Marissa had long been confident, brimming with the conviction that her charm and intelligence would protect her from failure. But charm cannot substitute diligence, and confidence cannot replace judgment. The fallout extended beyond the financial loss. Her parents, my siblings, and others who had tied themselves to her ambitions were drawn in as well, attempting to cover debts, pay legal fees, and maintain appearances. The family's social standing in Madison, which had always been a carefully curated display of propriety and influence, began to falter. Invitations dwindled. Casual conversations carried whispered critiques, and old friends, wary of the scandal, maintained a polite distance. I watched it unfold from a distance, observing the ripple effects with the calm detachment I had cultivated over years of navigating my own family's judgment. It was not cruelty that kept me silent. It was understanding. I had spent decades witnessing how poor decisions driven by pride or the desire for approval carried consequences that could not be mitigated by anger or reproach. Marissa would have to navigate this herself, as I had navigated my own journey toward autonomy. Caleb noticed the tension in my expression and reached for my hand, grounding me in the present. His calm steadied me, and I realized how far we had come together. We had built a life rooted in reason, mutual respect, and careful choices, one that shielded us from the kind of chaos now consuming the family I had left behind. I did not gloat. There was no vindictive satisfaction in the observation of Marissa's missteps. The lesson was clear. Practical and immutable consequences are the natural result of actions, and justice, or at least accountability, exists without bitterness if it is met with composure and reflection. Later that evening, I sat by our apartment window, watching the lights of Madison shimmer across the frozen river. The city moved on indifferent to the personal dramas of its residents. In that quiet, I understood that my peace, carefully maintained and fiercely protected, was a triumph not of luck, but of deliberate choices, of boundaries enforced, and of wisdom earned over decades. The world outside could unfold as it would, but within the walls of our home we remained steady, anchored in the life we had chosen. The quiet of our Madison apartment had become a sanctuary in ways I had never imagined possible. After witnessing Marissa's missteps and the fallout that followed, I found myself reflecting on the life lessons that had brought me here. Boundaries, I realized, were not just abstract concepts or polite suggestions. They were the scaffolding that allowed me to build a life of calm, agency, and clarity. I thought back to the countless dinners, holiday gatherings, and everyday interactions with my family. Over the decades, each one a subtle test of patience and resilience. The constant comparisons, the judgment, the subtle undermining, all of it had taught me unwillingly the value of self-protection. At first, I had responded with quiet compliance, shrinking to fit their expectations. Later, rebellion came in small increments, a decision made quietly, a choice taken without permission, a step towards self-recognition. Now, years later, the practice of boundaries had matured into something deliberate. I understood that protecting one's peace was not selfishness. It was preservation. Each boundary drawn, each line maintained, created a space where I could think clearly, act intentionally, and love fully without compromise. Caleb had been instrumental in this realization, offering steady support without encroaching, respecting my autonomy while sharing the journey of life together. The events with Marissa had crystallized the lesson. Her choices and the consequences they brought into her life had reminded me that freedom to act without interference requires structure, discipline, and clear limits. I did not need to intervene to correct or to rescue. I could observe, witness, and learn, letting her experience the natural outcomes of her actions. In that restraint, I found peace. Sitting at the window with a cup of tea, I traced the reflection of the city lights across the frozen river below. The calm of the evening mirrored the calm I felt within. For the first time in decades, I could measure my own value, my own competence, and my own choices independently of external validation. Each decision I made for myself, every boundary enforced, was a quiet declaration that my life was mine. I thought of past holidays, the silent dinners, where tension hung heavier than conversation, and the unspoken rules that had dictated my youth. I realized now that understanding when to speak and when to remain silent, when to engage and when to step back, was a form of strength I had only begun to appreciate. Boundaries were not walls built to separate. They were guardrails keeping me steady as life moved forward, preventing the weight of others' expectations from pushing me off course. Caleb placed a hand over mine, his fingers warm and reassuring. "You've built something solid here," he said quietly. I nodded, letting the truth settle in. This life, this partnership, and the choices we made together were a manifestation of boundaries respected, of autonomy, maintained, of peace, protected. I knew now that the ability to enforce limits and preserve one's emotional and mental space was not a skill learned overnight. It was the accumulation of years, the deliberate cultivation of awareness, patience, and courage. And in this recognition, I felt the power that had always eluded me, the power to live fully, intentionally, and freely. The doorbell rang 3 times in rapid succession, sharp and insistent, pulling me from a quiet morning spent reviewing campaign notes. Caleb glanced at me, brow furrowed, and I felt a familiar tension rise, not from fear, but from recognition of what awaited. I set down my coffee and moved to the door, pausing just long enough to compose myself before swinging it open. There they stood, Marissa, my daughter, flanked by my sister Lydia and their father Daniel. Their faces were a mix of fatigue and hesitance expressions, carefully constructed to soften the intensity of years past. "Evelyn," Marissa began, her voice trembling slightly. We need to talk." I let my eyes sweep over them, noting the subtle changes in posture, the way Lydia's usual smirk had softened the tightness around Daniel's jaw that suggested uncertainty rather than critique. There was an apology lingering somewhere beneath their words, a hope that I might be willing to receive it. I crossed my arms lightly, steadying myself, aware of the vulnerability in opening a door, both literal and emotional, after so many years of distance. Margaret's call earlier had prepared me in part for the situation. The family's attempts at reconciliation were sincere, but I knew sincerity did not erase the past, nor did it automatically grant permission to trust. I could feel Caleb's steady presence beside me, the reassurance in his touch, reminding me that any decision I made now was my own. Marissa's words came haltingly, layered with regret. "Mom, for everything, the dinners, the comparisons, the constant pressure, I'm sorry. I didn't understand and I acted poorly." Her gaze flickered to Lydia, who gave a small nod, a quiet acknowledgement of her own complicity in the past judgments. Daniel's voice joined, softer than usual, attempting to bridge the silence. "We've let things go too far. We want to make amends." I listened, each phrase registering with a calm detachment that was entirely intentional. I could feel the weight of years of expectations and judgments pressing against me. Yet I remained unmoved, grounded. There was power in my ability to receive their words without surrendering control over myself. I could hear the apology. I could recognize the effort, and yet I did not need to act on their hope. I allowed a long pause before speaking, letting the moment linger. "The dead cannot come back," I said, my voice firm but measured. The words landed with precision, an acknowledgement of the irreversibility of past choices. Marissa's lips parted in surprise. Lydia's eyes widened faintly. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, realizing that no explanation or plea could erase what had been. I closed the door deliberately, the click echoing like a punctuation mark to years of history. Caleb's hand rested lightly on my shoulder, and I allowed a faint exhale, a release of tension that had built over decades. Outside, the winter air remained crisp, but within our apartment, I felt the calm certainty of autonomy maintained, of boundaries respected. We returned to the warmth of our shared space, leaving the apology where it belonged, acknowledged, but not allowed to dictate the present. I felt the quiet satisfaction of having chosen my peace over obligation, understanding that reconciliation, like forgiveness, could not be demanded or rushed. It could only be offered on terms that did not compromise the self. The knock at the door came sharp and persistent, breaking the quiet of our evening in Madison. I set down the book I had been reading and exchanged a glance with Caleb. My heart didn't race, and my hands didn't shake, as they might have years ago. Instead, I felt a calm resolve, the kind that comes from decades of experience of learning when to stand and when to step away. When I opened the door there, they stood Marissa, Lydia, and Daniel once again. Their faces were etched with fatigue, mixed with a cautious hope that I might respond differently this time. They had traveled the long road to apology, but I knew better than to assume their intentions could erase years of judgment, manipulation, and misunderstanding. Marissa's voice broke the silence first. "Mom, we've made mistakes. We're sorry for everything, the dinners, the constant criticism, the way we treated you." She glanced at Lydia, whose expression had softened, and then at Daniel, who nodded with an air of humility I hadn't often seen in him. I let them speak, letting the words wash over me, careful not to interrupt or react. I listened to their remorse, recognizing its sincerity, but refusing to let it dictate my present. This moment was not theirs to control, it was mine to navigate. Every pause, every hesitation on their part only reinforced what I already knew. The boundaries I had set were mine alone to enforce. After they finished, I inhaled deeply, feeling the crisp winter air that had seeped in through the small crack of the door before it closed fully. I placed a hand gently on the doorframe, steadying myself. The years of control, comparison, and expectation had taught me the importance of clarity and firmness. This was not a moment for negotiation or compromise. It was a moment for truth. The dead cannot come back. I said, my voice calm but deliberate, each word carrying the weight of decades of experience, restraint, and self-knowledge. The room seemed to pause. Marissa's eyes widened. Lydia's mouth opened in shock, and Daniel's expression faltered. They had hoped, perhaps, that my acceptance of their apology would erase the past, that one word from me could restore everything to the way it had been. But nothing could undo years of choices, and nothing could alter the person I had become. I let the silence linger, letting the clarity of my decisions settle around them. I had spent decades accommodating, adjusting, and sacrificing pieces of myself to meet expectations that were never truly mine. Tonight, I reclaimed my authority, my voice, and my peace. I did not need to argue. I did not need to justify. The boundary was absolute, and its enforcement required only conviction, not confrontation. Slowly, I closed the door. The click echoed through the hallway like a punctuation mark on the narrative of my life, a definitive statement that this chapter was over. Caleb was beside me instantly, his hand warm on my shoulder, a grounding presence in the aftermath of the encounter. I felt the calm settle fully into my bones, a deep, enduring peace that had been absent for far too long. We turned back to the apartment, the lights of Madison twinkling softly outside. I realized that walking away was not an act of abandonment, but of self-preservation. In that clarity, I understood the power of boundaries, the the freedom they provided, and the strength it takes to enforce them. Nothing and no one could diminish the autonomy I had fought to reclaim. For the first time in my life, I felt completely untethered from the expectations that had weighed on me for decades. The door was closed, the line drawn, and my life was entirely my own. The mornings in our Madison apartment had a quiet rhythm that I had come to cherish. Sunlight spilled through the tall windows, illuminating the warm, lived-in corners of our home. Caleb moved through the kitchen, humming softly, while I sipped my coffee, reflecting on the life we had built. It was a life of deliberate choices of moments, crafted from authenticity rather than obligation, and for the first time in decades, I felt completely at ease within it. Work had become a source of pride and fulfillment. The nonprofit campaign I had led continued to gain attention across the city, and I had been invited to consult on additional projects, each one challenging and stimulating in equal measure. Recognition no longer carried the sting of comparison or the weight of family judgment. Colleagues celebrated my efforts. Clients trusted my guidance, and each success reinforced the quiet truth I had discovered years ago. My worth was intrinsic independent of anyone else's approval. Caleb's garage thrived as well. Word of his expertise spread steadily through Madison, bringing in new clients who respected his skill and integrity. I watched him on weekends, sleeves rolled up, hands deft and confident, as he repaired engines and guided apprentices. I had never known a life where our achievements could coexist without competition or scrutiny. Here in our shared space, each of us flourished on our own terms, and the joy of that was almost tangible. We discovered small pleasures that anchored us in the present. Weekend strolls along the frozen banks of the Yahara River, quiet afternoons in the local bookstore, shared dinners where laughter came freely. All of it wove together a tapestry of contentment. The apartment walls bore the marks of our personalities. A painting Caleb had framed photographs of the city, a shelf lined with my favorite books. Every detail was a testament to choices made intentionally rather than to satisfy someone else. Evenings were quiet and filled with reflection. I often found myself leaning against the balcony railing, gazing at the Madison skyline. The years of judgment and expectation from family felt distant, almost unreal. In those moments, I could see the journey I had taken, the careful cultivation of boundaries, the insistence on self-respect, the steady assertion of autonomy. All the lessons, the small victories, the painful encounters, they had led me to this calm certainty. Caleb would join me, resting his hand over mine, and we would speak of hopes, dreams, and the life we envisioned. We talked about travel, about eventually moving to a larger home with space for a garden, about the possibility of adopting a rescue dog. These conversations were filled with possibility, not obligation. They were ours alone, crafted from mutual respect and understanding. At night, as the city lights twinkled through our windows, I often reflected on the woman I had become. Evelyn Harper, the one who had endured years of scrutiny, who had been compared, criticized, and dismissed, was now fully herself. I had learned that life on one's own terms was not a destination, but a continuous practice of choosing authenticity, of prioritizing joy, and of safeguarding peace. For the first time, the past felt like a distant echo rather than a chain around my ankles. I was free to live, to love, and to thrive wholly and unapologetically. And with Caleb by my side, I knew that the life we had built was real, resilient, and entirely our own.